So our parsha starts off with a really fascinating story. And the story is about Jacob. And Jacob is traveling. He's traveling to hopefully find a wife. And along the way, he has an experience where he encounters God. How does he encounter God? He has a dream. In the dream, he sees a ladder. And in the ladder, or he sees angels going up and down. And then he says, oh my goodness, I didn't realize it. God is in this place. And that's the general part of it. But within it, God promises him basically the same thing that he promised his father and grandfather. I'm going to make this land yours and spread you all over it. And then Jacob makes what's called a vow. It says a neder. And he says, God, if you keep your end of the deal, you'll be my God. And the word neder got me thinking about nedarim. Nedarim is a topic that the only time we really talk about it is on the eve of Yom Kippur, on Kol Nidre, right? So Nidre comes from the word neder, and it means a vow. My hotspot is coming to life. Here we go. And otherwise, we don't really think about it too much. So the first question I have about vows is, why would somebody make a vow, especially a vow with God? Right? In this case, is Jacob kind of ambivalent in his faith? And he's saying, if you come through for me, and you give me all these things, then you'll be my God. Then I'll follow you. It doesn't seem to indicate that from the text, but otherwise, why do we make vows? I think of it in terms of the famous 5 stages. We often say the 5 stages of grief, but I was in a workshop this week for the National Institute of Jewish Hospice, and David Kessler, who was a student of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with those 5 stages, said that one of the things that they were annoyed by was that people called it the 5 stages of grief instead of the 5 stages of death, which is what it was. It was research on people dying. And not for people who were in grief for somebody else who died, but it was the people themselves and their experience. Having said that, it still makes a lot of sense to the grieving process as well, which is why it's become so popular and become known as the 5 stages of grief. So here we go. Give me a second. So the stages, for those that don't know, is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. A little mnemonic to remember them is DABDA. D-A-B-D-A, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And when I think of a vow, I think of bargaining. Right? It's not a leap of faith per se. It's a bargaining. If you come through for me, I'll give you this. If you give me that, I'll handle with you a little here and there. So that's kind of how I see it. And then the question is, what do we know about vows? Luckily, my source sheet just came to life, so it'll help me. All right. Can you all see it? You could.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Good. Thank you. All right. I have way too many tabs open. All right. So from this week's Parsha of Vayetze, yes, Vayetze, the line that caught my attention is Vayider Yaakov Neder. Jacob then made a vow, saying, Im yeh Elokim imadi ushmarani baderech. If God remains with me, if he protects me on this journey that I'm making, and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and it goes on, then he will be my God. All right, so Jacob makes a conditional vow to God. And another question that comes to mind is this an acceptable practice in Judaism? One of the things that we like to pride ourselves in Judaism is that we question things. In other religions, it's not as acceptable necessarily to question things. This seems like not just questioning, but there's an element of bargaining. It's conditional. It's not the unconditional love that we all seek. I don't know what just happened over here. Okay, moving along. I got some message in Hebrew. Fascinating. Okay. Hopefully what I said okay to is not too... nothing too serious. Anyway. So Jacob makes his conditional vow, is acceptable. Once a year on Kol Nidre night, we hear a sermon that addresses the Neder vow, but not much otherwise. Let's give it a closer look. I was just skimming through Wikipedia and found this little tidbit. The word Neder is mentioned 33 times in the Pentateuch, 19 of which occur in the book of Numbers, which is not the book that we're reading right now. We're reading Genesis. So here's kind of the main text that's used when studying vows. And this is from the book of Numbers. Vayidaber Moshe el Roshei Hamatot Livnei Yisrael Lamer Zeh Hadavar Asher Tziva Adonai. Now Moses spoke unto the heads of the tribes, saying, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. When a man voweth a vow unto the Lord, or sweareth an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. And one of the interesting discussions we find in the Talmud is the way it's presented is not, hey, there's a mitzvah for you to make, this or that kind of vow. But it's sort of, if a person does it, then keep your word. At least keep your word, right? And some of the Tanaim and certainly Amoraim were either ambivalent about vows or very clearly against them, and say some pretty harsh things for those that make vows. In part, their issue is because once a person takes on a vow, they take on added responsibility for them to themselves. And then if they don't keep the vow, then they're violating a positive commandment, which is to follow through on your vow, and the negative commandment, which is to not follow through, basically. Based on the above text for Numbers 30, it seems like it was an accepted practice. Some have the practice of stating b'li neder. You may have noticed, if speaking to an observant person, they might say something like, I'll get back to you in 20 minutes, b'li neder. And it might just sound like another mumbling, but it's actually a pretty serious thing. And essentially what they're saying is, I just committed to do something, but I'm not committing to it on the level of a vow. because the level of a vow has very specific halachot related to it. So yeah, I'll get back to you in 20 minutes, but really it's 30 minutes or maybe 2 weeks. I don't know exactly. So B'li Neder is giving it out. So just a couple of examples of vows in the Tanakh. For those that don't remember, Tanakh is the term that we use for the written Torah. So that includes the first 5 books of the Chumash, as well as the books of the prophets and the books of the writings. And the following 2 examples are from the prophets. One is the story of, I don't know how exactly to pronounce this in English, but I'll give it a go. Jephthah's vow to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his door. Does anybody remember this story? Is it ringing a bell for anybody?
Yes.
Do you feel confident to tell it?
Well, I know that his daughter came out the door and he had to sacrifice her.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. But what was the vow?
I forgot.
A conditional vow? Yeah. So it was a conditional vow. He was going to battle, and he was afraid of losing. And so he figured, let me get some leverage here with God. And, you know, God, if you allow me to win the war, I'm going to sacrifice whatever walks out of my front door when I get home. Extremely strange.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi, it's Ruth. Wouldn't he have expected somebody he loved to come out the door? Not a pet goat? I mean, you know.
That's what would make sense. And why would he think that God would want him to sacrifice his family member?
Yeah.
Right. So the whole story is bizarre, and it's a study in itself. Because of the language of it, some commentators say that he didn't actually sacrifice his daughter. You know, in the story, the daughter says, "Yeah, I get it. You have to do what you have to do, but give me a couple of months to grieve." Interestingly, grieve here is before the death, right? So it's anticipatory grief, anticipating her own death. But again, the story is bizarre. But the reason that I bring it, and it, you know, it'll come up again, and we can go into it, and it's in a lot of feminist literature, just because of, you know, it's with a woman, and it's pretty extreme of a man, at least in the simple meaning, you know, killing his daughter, which also taps into human sacrifice, which is extremely problematic.
Rabbi?
Yes.
In Mozart's opera Idomeneo, it's the same basic plot, but he's supposed to sacrifice his son, who's the first one he sees when he comes back from the Trojan War.
Ah, interesting. Right. It would also be curious to see, you know, that in some of the stories in the Torah, people have found parallels in other cultures, and to see if this is the case with this story, or if Mozart, I think you said Mozart, was basing it on the Torah but reinterpreting it.
It was an old Italian libretto that had been done maybe 50 years before Mozart got it. So it had been already made into an opera several times before Mozart did it.
Right, but I'm saying, what is it based on an ancient story, and is it based
on a Greek myth?
Ah, there you go. So that's an example of that, where you have some of the stories in the Torah that you also find in other cultures to different degrees. All right. Another one is the story of Hannah. I particularly like this story because it's about my namesake, the prophet Samuel. So Hannah, you know, just like we've been talking about with the matriarchs and the fertility issues, so Hannah also was having trouble conceiving. So she goes and prays at the temple. And of course, the priest immediately sees a woman getting emotional, and he decides that she's drunk. Anyway, she explains to him, "I'm not drunk. I'm just really distraught." And she makes a deal with God, and she says, "If you give me a son, I will dedicate him to the temple, and he'll be yours," basically. So this, again, is another conditional vow, and that's actually what happens. And Samuel was raised in the temple, and ultimately becomes a prophet. Can anybody think of any other examples from the Torah of conditional vows?
There's a whole thing of a Nazir who vows not, like Samson, who vows not to drink wine or cut his hair.
Right.
Exactly. Who is that on the phone there?
Shelley.
Yeah. Oh. It's also Jack. I still remember going back to Greek mythologies with Achilles and his heel. There was always this area of vulnerability that was sort of a spot that you would think would be safe.
Right.
And it just wasn't. You know, we have the expression Achilles heel, so obviously it's been with us a long time.
Okay. But do you see that as a conditional vow?
Yeah, because she promised him to God, but she held him by his heel, so he couldn't be 100%.
Got it.
There was just some condition to it. It wasn't. He wasn't completely invulnerable at
Right.
this point. He was still vulnerable at one little spot of his anatomy, which was
Right.
basically protected. The same kind of thing, in my mind, anyway.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. And to go back to what Shelley said, Samson is probably the most famous Nazir, and a Nazir is basically somebody who says, in addition to all the obligations of the Torah, I'm going to take it one step further and be even more pious by not cutting my hair and not drinking wine. Right? Which, I mean, not drinking wine, okay, that's a little bit easier to understand. Why is not cutting the hair more pious is not as clear. But that's certainly a thing, and there's all kinds of discussion and rules related to it. All right.
Shelley again, and anybody could do that. I mean, I could say I take a vow not to eat knishes for 6 months, right, if I wanted to.
Exactly.
Now it's like Lent.
What's that?
That's like Lent, when you eliminate something that you enjoy for a period of time as a commitment.
Right. So
For the
interestingly, in halacha, the term neder is not necessarily conditional. The examples that are often used is exactly like, what Shelley said, or like what people do for Lent, which is just restricting, limiting themselves for something, but not necessarily with a condition that if I do this, you'll do X, Y, and Z, I'll get something, which is more like a covenant. So even though in our parsha the term neder is used, it doesn't match the halachic term neder. And one of the interesting things is, this topic is such an important topic that there's a Mishnah, an entire section of the Mishnah dedicated to it. And then there's, a book in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud and the Tosefta. However, some modern scholars noticed that the text and the syntax and all of it of this particular Mishnah and Talmud really seems different to a lot of the other ones, and they think that in the original writing or discussion of the Talmud, it was a thing, but when it came to the school of Pampedisa and the later scholars who ultimately redacted the Talmud, they just weren't interested. this whole thing of Nadarim wasn't a priority for them, and they never really edited it. And so they see it as more kind of raw and choppy. All right, so those are those two stories. So here's a random Mishnah from Nadarim, which I thought people can relate to in terms of Kol Nidre, the idea of dissolving vows. So this is a Mishnah from Nadarim. Actually, I brought it from the Talmud. So that's why it says 20b. Otherwise, it would present it differently. The sages dissolved 4 types of vows without the requirement of a request to a halachic authority. Vows of exhortation, vows of exaggeration, vows that are unintentional, and vows whose fulfillment is impeded by circumstances beyond one's control. So basically, the way I interpret this is that if the circumstances around making the vow were that the person didn't really mean it, they didn't really get what they were committing to, then the sages can dissolve it. Having said that, in the discussion of the Talmud, and we'll see how much time we have, maybe we'll discuss some of it. It seems that any vow, or at least most vows, could be dissolved. The question was just what method was necessary, how much of a consultation was necessary to do it. Interestingly, I mentioned to my father before the class, I said I was going to be teaching a class on Nadarim, and if he had any 1-minute insights to add to it, and he did. And he said that Nadarim is the only thing that a child under bar mitzvah has responsibility for. Now, just to clarify, when we say under, it means, maybe around 12 years old or something like that, not a 2-year-old. But that there's certain sense that they do have a certain level of awareness of what they're committing to, and they are responsible for it, which is fascinating because on the other end of it, we have all kinds of ways of dissolving vows. So it would seem like it's not a very serious thing if we can, kind of go and dissolve them. But, having it be the only thing, the only mitzvah, the only prohibition, where a child would have responsibility even before bar mitzvah, says how kind of weighty and how seriously this was taken.
Rabbi Shelley, I have a little bit of a contrary view. Perhaps you could straighten me out. I always thought that a neder was so important, and that's why some of the most ingenious areas of the Talmud that I'm aware of, the rabbis go to great trouble to try to get people out of the neder, precisely because it's so consequential.
Exactly. And that's really the truth, is that they did see it as extremely consequential, which is why they even extended it before bar mitzvah, and why there's a tremendous amount of discussion of what kind of vow. So the Mishnah starts off, for example, discussing even if a person made a vow, but they used a different term for it, or they didn't even say the word vow, but they said something which kind of can be interpreted as vow, it still counts. Right? And so it was an extremely serious thing. And so the only other explanation for why the later Talmudists wouldn't have included it is maybe because they felt that, and maybe at that time, people took it so seriously that it wasn't done very often. As is common now, we don't make these formal vows. Having said that, there are exceptions. For example, when you go into court, right? It's a very clear vow. It'd be interesting. I don't know what the legal world would say if you went into court and they asked you if you're going to say the whole truth and you say b'li neder after, and whether the judge will kick you out or not.
Rabbi, do Jews make wedding vows also?
We do not. That's not part of the Jewish wedding. I mean, we do make one vow, which is Hareya Mikudeshet Li, right? You are sanctified to me. B'tabadzu Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. And basically, it's a vow against polygamy, interestingly. It's saying sanctified, meaning that something that's holy is separate and is not shared by others. So that I would have to look more into it, if exactly what category it falls into. And I might go into, I found a really interesting piece, which I'll see how easy it is for me to find it. A rabbi really breaks down the different types of vows and their halachic meaning. So, for example, there's negative mitzvot and there's positive mitzvot, and so depending on what the vow is would determine it. Let me see if I can find it. Give me a second here. I think this is it. Let's see. Different types of obligations, right? There are 6 main ways that one may create an obligation upon oneself, either to fulfill something or to abstain from doing something. Nedarim, vows, the one we've been talking about. Neder, a vow in which one declares that something otherwise permitted is now prohibited. Right? So if we think of Jacob's vow that we talked about initially, he's not abstaining from something per se. It's just a broader, if you come through for me, I'll follow you. Right? But from a halachic perspective, it's specifically abstaining from something that's otherwise permitted. Shavua, an oath, in which one swears to fulfill or refrain from some activity, such as swearing that one will fast on a certain day, or that one will say Tehillim every day. Right? So this is a very specific commitment to doing something. And depending on the perspective, in some cases, a neder is seen as more stringent. In other cases, a shavua is seen as more stringent. So an example of a shavua, to repair his somewhat sloppy record at making it to minyan every morning, shachar, which is a play on words because shachar means morning, but he's pretending that this person's name is shachar. Shachar swears a shavua that he will be in shul for shacharit for the next 3 days. Should he fail to make it to shacharit any of those days, he will be breaking his shavua, which contravenes a Torah prohibition, right? Because the reading that we did from Numbers said a neder or a shavua, and so if you break it, then it's a Torah prohibition. Whether a specific declaration constitutes a neder or shavua depends on the halachic technicalities, usually contingent on how one makes the declaration. All right. Kabbalat mitzvot. I wonder if the bar mitzvah celebration qualifies as this one. Someone who declares, I will arise early and study this chapter or that Masechta. Masechta is a tractate, a book of the Talmud, has declared a great vow to the God of Israel. right? So, it might be New Year's and you're like, you know what? It's time for me to study some Torah. I'm going to start getting up every morning at this and this time. It's serious business. Considering how many people follow through on New Year's resolutions, you might want to abstain or throw in a bali neder. Kabbalat tzedakah. There's special rules related to tzedakah, which say that even deciding to give tzedakah without verbalizing one's intention creates an obligation to donate tzedakah. Right? And that's really fascinating because now we're being held accountable for our thought. Right? Normally in Judaism, it's all about action. Your thoughts, that's bonus. That's overtime. If you're going to have purity of thought, you're already, on a higher level. But we're judged for our actions. But over here, it's saying that when it comes to tzedakah, if we commit in our mind to donating to a certain cause or a certain amount or whatever it is, we've already created that obligation. So that's performing a stringency, in Hebrew known as a chumrah. Someone who's aware that performing a certain hidur, beautifying of halachas. So, the greatest example of that, which he probably brings, is of an esrog on Sukkot. All you need is a kosher esrog. A kosher esrog, you can probably get to $20 or $30. But there are people that spend literally hundreds of dollars to get the most beautiful, big, it gets pretty crazy. Esrog to have hidur mitzvah, to beautify the mitzvah. However, there's some obligations that come along with this this habit. Someone who is aware that performing a certain hidur in halacha is not obligatory and begins doing so, intending to observe it regularly becomes required to continue the practice as a form of vow. It's interesting because I'm thinking of, for example, women, wearing a talit or putting on tefillin, and in the halachic discussions about whether that's permissible, whether it should be encouraged. One of the things that's come up is this issue, right? So a woman may be feeling particularly inspired or may be wanting to make a political statement or whatever the motivation. And so they go, they join the women of the wall, they go to the kotel, and they put on a talit, they put on tefillin. They might even do it, maybe it's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, they do it 2 days in a row. At what point, if they do it for long enough, have they now basically accepted this higher standard of observance, and now they've raised the bar and they can't lower it? It's not always clear cut, but it's certainly something to consider. Especially when there's, when we're doing it more out of the excitement of the moment or of a particular cause, and not necessarily because we really buy into it and think that we should do it all the time. There's also the idea of chazaka, that if you do something 3 times, that's where the line is, and then it becomes an obligation. Let's see. All right, let me go back to the other text, see if there's anything else I wanted to get in from there. I don't know why I have this weird split screen here. Whatever, it's fine. We can work with it. All right, so that was it. And then the last thing I thought was really fascinating. I found something at the Torah.com about this story. And when you read, hopefully if you get hopefully you get a chance to read at least the beginning of the Parsha this week, you might notice that the text of the story, it doesn't flow very smoothly. And we have that in some of the other stories. There might be something later. So, for example, when God says, "I'm going to give this land, to Abraham, to you," and basically it's just a repetition of the same promise that was already given earlier. And it just seems incongruent with the flow of the text. And a lot of commentators have struggled with what the meaning is, and it affects our discussion because part of that story is the vow. So this professor, Baruch Schwartz, looks at it from the perspective of the documentary hypothesis and reworks the story. If for those that believe in it, it makes me think, we say there's 70 interpretations of the Torah. Whether the documentary hypothesis counts as one of the 70 or not depends who you ask. But if you rework the story with the assumption that it's a combination of two stories that were put together, it actually flows much more easily. So, without going into the all of the reasons that he believes we should come to this conclusion, but I'll just go to the vows part. Jacob's vow consists of two distinct undertakings. First, that Yahweh will be his God, which means that he accepts Yahweh, and the reason it's specific, they get very specific about which name of God is used, because if there's one name used consistently for a while and then all of a sudden there's another one in there, the question is what just happened. And for those that believe in the documentary hypothesis, what just happened is that somebody took a piece of another book that had a similar story and inserted it, and that's why you have a different name of God. Jacob's vow that the spot which, as revealed in his dream, provides unique access to the heavens will become a divine abode to which he will bring. Let me just start from the beginning of that one. Sorry. Jacob's vow consists of two distinct undertakings. First, that Yahweh will be his God, which means that he accepts Yahweh's exclusive lordship over him. Second, that the spot which, as revealed in his dream, provides unique access to the heavens, will become a divine abode to which he will bring his tithes as an offering. I'll just keep reading and then see if I need to add anything. The two undertakings are far from identical, and they are not complementary either. Right, so just to repeat them, the first one is that he would take God as his God, or in this case, the specific name, Yahweh, Yud He Vav He. And the second one is that he's acknowledging, I had this dream in this spot, and all of a sudden I feel, God next to me, that this particular spot has special significance, and it is a gateway to heaven. And ultimately the temple will be built here, and people will come here feeling that if they pray in this particular spot, their prayers, the odds of their prayers being answered are better. The two undertakings are far from identical, and they are not complementary either. Moreover, why is it that when on the eve of Jacob's return to Canaan, God appears to him and reminds him of this vow? Only the consecration of the pillar and the place named Bethel are mentioned, with no reference to all of Yahweh's assurances as Jacob's corresponding promise of loyalty. All right. 8. Jacob's neder, his vow, consists of a promise. If God is with me, if he protects me, then Yahweh shall be my God. But a generalized undertaking, such as a promise to accept a particular deity as one's very own God, if certain conditions are met, rather than the pledge to worship the deity in a specific manner, as elsewhere in the Bible, does not qualify as a neder. Right? So why would he use the term neder here if this is not how the term is normally used? 9, why does Jacob's vow, which begins in the third person, if God is with me, if he protects me, etc., suddenly switch to the second person? And of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. So one answer would be that, the Torah wasn't that concerned about, there's the royal we, wasn't that concerned about second person or third person. But again, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the documentary hypothesis, then that's a red flag to say maybe there's an edit going on here. Finally, what is the purpose of the tale? Is it an ideology crediting Jacob as having established, or at least predicted, the eventual establishment of Bethel as a site of worship, as seems so clear from the story of the dream and the consecration of the stones? Or is it an account of how Yahweh communicated to Jacob the promise of land and progeny that he had made to Abraham? Both are important for the Torah narrative. But why do they both seem to be taking place at once? Right? And so his argument is the reason they're taking place at once is because there are two stories being combined here. So I just thought, there's many different perspectives that we can look at vows and Torah stories, including, sometimes we might make a vow in anger, and that leads to a whole tangent in the Talmud in the Darim about anger and the special places in hell for people that get angry, and it gets pretty fascinating, and seems to really be worried about anger from a psychological perspective. I wish it would say, rage or acting out anger, because I believe that anger is appropriate in certain situations, and without anger we aren't necessarily motivated to change things. So anger isn't always bad, but often when one of the motivations for making a neder could be anger, and that can be problematic as well. Anyway, I think that's enough for today. Any questions or comments?
Rabbi?
Go for it.
I just wanted to make a little note to what you said at the very beginning about Kubler-Ross.
Yeah.
I don't know if people know she was one of triplets.
I did not have.
She was Swiss.
I did know that.
And another thing was I attended a lecture that she gave. I guess it might have been in the last years of her life. She gave a lecture in Basel. It was very fascinating. So I just wanted to share that a little bit.
Was it on spirituality?
It was on death and unfinished business. The main topic was how people could die peacefully if they didn't have unfinished business hanging over their heads. And that had a big influence on me.
That does sound fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
And it reminds me also, this person that I heard last week, David Kessler, he added a sixth stage, and the sixth stage is meaning. And so after going through denial, being told, when a person is told that, there's nothing more we can do for you, basically being told that they're terminally ill. And of course, nothing more is a terrible way to present it, because there's plenty more, we just can't cure you. Doesn't mean we drop you like a hot potato. So denial, and then anger, whether it's anger at the doctors, anger at God, anger itself, bargaining. If I eat enough vegetables, or whatever. Depression, acceptance. So after that, there's also meaning, if we can find meaning in our experience, that I guess ideally brings more peace of mind. And the Kubler-Ross Foundation agreed to that add-on. At least that's what he says. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. I look forward to seeing you guys on Monday at 7:30. Anything else anybody can think of? Right.
No, well, just keep your eyes and ears open to lots of stuff that Ways and Means is planning. Trivia night. We have a rabbi who's a comedian. We hope we can get, what's the other thing? What I say, family trivia. And, the shtisel, the
show.
And the viewing of the first episode and then discussion. And it all is also involving ordering meals so that we, it's a fundraiser because the restaurant's going to give us donation and we charge for participation. But it sounds like some fun evenings that are that will come through. We have December. I have it in front of me, my notes. Give me a second. The 19th of December is the shtisel, and January 23rd is the family trivia, and Mark Wiener is hosting that.
Nice.
So it should be just a way to build community. Really, is the most important part of what we're doing, and to make a few bucks while we're at it.
It doesn't hurt. Speaking of programming, and Shelley, I don't know if you're still there.
Yes, I am.
So I'm thinking, and I'd just like some feedback of getting a support group going, maybe weekly, maybe every other week. I know that we have some psychologists and social workers who